I mean, what do people think about this? Because I would argue that apart from things like cam video, a lot of IoT things, like you mentioned, for example, monitoring pH in the soil, temperature monitoring, these aren't very data intensive things. So, for example, if you were going to send measurements of, for example, soil temperature, for example, how often would you be sending that? So, a video stream, okay, I give you that. But if you were going to lose transmissions or you were going to try to transmit and you have a communications protocol that ensures your transmission has been successful, your requirements maybe aren't that stringent for an IoT device monitoring temperature. What do people think?
Yeah, I agree fully. For the like the Raspberry Pi and reading the pH, these values are small, less than like text files, less than a few kilobytes. But when you start going into drone video, drone imagery, camera and surveillance imagery and video, and these high bandwidth items, then you start to really see the bandwidth being used. For example, a 4K video, which you probably don't need, but if you are going to do a 4K video, you can't even begin to imagine the size of recording 24 hours of 4K, depending on the farmer's request. But usually I would try to bring them down to 1080p, but you're
Mm,
using a lot of data by going down into 1080p, because the benefit of 4K is that you have that white image and you can zoom into any part of that image to get a 1080p image. Now, if you're starting from 1080p, if you zoom in, you're definitely not getting that fidelity and definitely not getting that quality. Now, if you go into the drone surveillance side of things, then you have 20 megapixel cameras now or more, depending on the kind of drone you're using. And all
mm,
that data, not only are you all that data has to be sent somewhere. So it's going through the hub, and you have to send it to a cloud server or server on the ground, and all of those data sets start to add up very quickly, especially in the IoT of things. And then you have a lot of stuff pinging the servers. It starts
mm,
to become a lot if you don't have the bandwidth capable. It's not super necessary,
mm,
because you can't downstream your video, you can't downstream your imagery, but
mm,
it starts to become a hindrance the higher spec you go up.
mm. So I guess what I'd say is I wouldn't argue about if you have a problem with Telegram, but in terms of bandwidth. But does that pose another opportunity in that what you typically did, for example, when I did robotics years ago, when you couldn't transfer large sets of data, right? Is that what you couldn't transfer, you tried to do the processing closer to the point you were at, yes? And then you transfer that data. So if you can't transfer all the data you want to do the processing remotely, then isn't there an opportunity to do more image processing at the source where you're really working, and then transfer the information with the results that is relevant?
There definitely is, but then you run into the other discussion with the locations that you're putting these devices in that
Yeah,
do the additional processing.
yeah.
So I mean, down here we have a lot of media larceny.
Mm.
So how do you secure those devices, going forward, so
Yes,
that
yes.
when you do the processing,
Mm.
then that you guarantee that they'll be safe, and
Yes.
then that data will be safe as well, because then you have more data points where the data is exposed. So
Yes.
it is a possibility. It's not impossible. It's just requires a different solution to a different set of issues.
Yeah, and as you said, you are right. If you put more processing at closer to the point, you are also making your things more expensive, because the advantage of distributed processing is that you can transfer the data and have your expensive processing in one place. Yeah, so yeah, you're right. There always
I-
cost twos and fro's.
I'd like to throw my 2 cents in here.
Mm,
Um, so I use agriculture as an example, but of course, I would argue in some cases that environmental monitoring should be part of agriculture, right? It's another facet. So again, the project in Guyana is 12,000 acres of citrus, right? It's sandy soil, so the soil has been augmented with fertilizers and so on. Part of the mandate that we have on that site is to have 25 wells drilled all across the property, monitoring the groundwater to check for nitrate seepage and so on, right? So that we do not have fertilizers or insecticides or pesticides seeping into the groundwater, right? And there's also some streams and so on nearby, again, also being monitored, so it's always being, um, monitored for nitrates and so on. But none of that is done on the cloud, right? All of that is being processed on the edge, and the thing about it is compute is getting very cheap. You understand? It's a kind of amazing the kind of compute you can stick in a one new rack mount, thing and stick in a field under with a solar panel, so we haven't done, significant projects where internet, in Guyana, internet is variable, where that particular site is located 100 kilometers away from anything, so there's no internet at all, but we do have actually a LoRaWAN network running, and data can eventually be trickled back to the cell network to the point that we actually have it set up to do notification if something is wrong. So like we do POC monitoring on the property, right? Mainly because the brush fires and so on, and the easiest way to detect if you have a fire is the detection of smoke particles and so on in the air. So, we set up a alerting then that if the foreman or, the farm, no one's at the farm, there's alerting available in monitoring, Likewise, we also have some projects where people are doing stuff offshore. And again, you're monitoring ocean temperature, nitrates, dissolved oxygen, and all of these things don't actually require a huge amount of bandwidth. And this is something that I think people need to take into account. That when you look at a first world solution in inverted commas, something that's designed for the States of Europe or these places where bandwidth is ubiquitous and cheap and cloud computing is native, it lends it will everybody will lean towards thinking automatically everything is in cloud, everything is in thing. Whereas in our case, we have actually bought IoT devices from these suppliers and found that, yes, they work mostly, but they're not really designed for tropical climates. And so we have actually had a case where we have actually taken apart their sensors, bought components from China and essentially built our own versions of them to our own spec, where it, added conformal coating and all these kind of things, but there's a little engineering. And they work. And we optimize them for lower power usage, that kind of thing. And it because we don't have the resources to hook everything up to Amazon or Google Cloud or whatever to have that really offloading and crunching and so on. We have actually been pushing to, we have actually been doing a lot of work in optimizing the software and so on, how we execute the software. And that is something also that that's from a programming point of view. Everybody just wants to throw a library in and so on, but nobody really checks to optimize the code anymore. And I always tell new programmers / engineers when they come into my business, I said my first computer was a 286 at 50 megahertz. You understand? So, and the kind of things that we could have squeezed out of that processor, because we optimize every bit of code, come on, you can buy a Ryzen V1000 processor with just 6 cores at 3 gigahertz or something and stick that on a 12-volt power supply and stick it in the field, right? You telling me you cannot optimize that to crunch how much ever data you want? Is it sexy? Is it sexy? Is it sexy as having it run in cloud? Probably not, but guess what? It will get the job done. And I think that is where, in some cases, the Caribbean has an opportunity to shine. That out of the box thinking. Because I have seen a lot of people come from the UK and so on, and they want the data that we could produce. They are willing to essentially give us access. There was one gentleman from the UK, what was Richard's last name? I can't remember. He has a product called Eco Engine, which is essentially, he gives you an API, you plug all the IoT stuff, and it gives you a nice little dashboard kind of thing. You understand? And he's quite happy. He says, he's willing to give people access to his app API for free, but of course, he really wants all that data because he knows the value of the data. And so, as I told somebody, I say sometimes you have to kind of look at, yes, you want to play with cool toys, but at the same time, are you giving away the crown jewels to play with the cool toys? And that's something I think a lot of us need to keep in mind. That's about it for now.
No, I agree with a lot of what you said. I mean, and I think my thing is always opportunity. And in particular, what you said about opportunities in terms of power optimization, etc. I mean, recently I was speaking to someone about, get a lot of recent about graduates who leave school and they will, for example, talk about monitoring, and they will feel that monitoring means that if you have a processor and you're measuring the temperature, you should just measure it as fast as the system, as fast as you have a loop. So you just go forward, wherever, give me a measurement. I was explaining to a young man some time ago that, that if you run the loop as fast as you can go, that's power, right? So you can decide that your requirement, you have to take power requirements into consideration. And as you've said, countries which have lots of access to processing power sometimes don't take into account. These are opportunities for us. And I agree with you. If you need to strip a part out of something and do it better, that's what we should be doing. But these are opportunities. Because if those things work in our climates, it means they may be also work in other climates. They may be also work in other markets. So I see these as opportunities, not just for the Caribbean, but exporting Caribbean technology to other places. But that's just my take on it.
Nick, I would agree with you wholeheartedly. From what Niran said, I like you.
This has more than what is required.
To the devices that were not found to be working the way that worked well in his scenario and took them apart. That spirit of the hacker, I think, is something that is absolutely essential. And that's the part of the innovation process that really we should be seeing more of. And perhaps the power versus performance balancing act that's required gives us that opportunity to go back to the old days where you had to optimize something to the nth degree to get it to perform the way you needed with the battery power that was available. So Niran, I tip my hat off to you. Yeah. I'd like to hear more about
I don't know if many people know that I get these things which are called breakdowns of systems. In some of the magazines I subscribe to. For example, they'll give you a breakdown of the iPhone, a breakdown of the device. So even that information is available. So you can tell all of the key components that make up something and learn from it and decide what you're going to take from it, which is what I do in a lot of my development. You get a development board, you get something else, and you create something new for your market, for whatever you're doing. That's how a lot of development is done. So this idea that you just have to take something else from somewhere else and use it. I mean, I work in the UK now, and I always laugh sometimes when people talk about the temperature ranges they test things at, because I was telling someone some time ago, one of my clients, that, the average temperature in St. Lucia, for example, is 25 degrees Celsius. So, this idea that you're going to test something and that's like they barely almost never leave it there. The system would be overheating. The board we were looking at, for example, would be overheating if you look at that average temperature. So they make things sometimes and they just don't take us into consideration, unless they actually plan to go into that market. And when we buy things, we sometimes need to factor that in. So I see that. I mean, the other thing is, so we talk about environmental, And there was a question about, so do we think that the telecoms, for the telecoms services that we have, do we think that they're sufficient? So we've had a number of ways of dealing with it. So there's talk about cloud computing, edge computing. So do we think that the telecoms system is really a hindrance to us? Or is it just something that we can deal with? What's the view?
So yeah, Nick, I think that's a good question, a good little puzzle to solve. I don't see the telecom infrastructure that we have in the Caribbean is what it is. Right? The hindrance will not come from that, because in the Caribbean we do have 3G, we do have 4G, and by the way, we can send IoT data over 2G network, which is before we had, you can send 2G. Okay, it won't be all the fancy, you cannot send video and all of this stuff, but you can send a few bytes and so on. So I don't think that would be the hindrance. The hindrance might come from more in terms of, I think someone mentioned in the beginning, what's the having that vision and being able to apply that to a roadmap, I don't know, integrate into the academic curriculums and so on, so that people coming out have that affinity to go in, take the things apart, hack them, make it fit for purpose for what they use, and start applying. Because in the end, what I have observed is that we have technology, we have the foundations, and it's a question of, let's apply this. Let's apply these technologies. Let's capture the data. And as I'm listening here, I'm seeing that people are already doing that. We're getting the data. Let's run the models. Can we leverage what's existing already in some of the industrialized countries where maybe, I think if someone is doing a project and they're on the Asia network for Microsoft, you have the opportunity to download models that they've already built for a number of things, for prediction models, for quality, for all types of different things. Depending, of course, on the contract you have, right? But so, and maybe if not them, probably you can get some freeware, you have people doing P programming and so on. That could, let's say, be the launch pad for us to then start off before we go to the next step. That's my view.
So we've spoken about agriculture, environment, telecoms. I'll ask the question about power. So we've got devices in the fields. You've got maybe, what's the thinking with regard to powering devices, and in terms of battery or connecting to power supplies? What's the thinking there? Does anybody have any kind of insight on that area? Because I must admit I have no real feel for that myself.
Well, usually in all the projects I have done, it's a combination of solar, wind, and lithium-ion batteries. And well, courtesy Tesla and so on, you have a lot of excess supply on the market too. So if you're willing to wrangle some used cells, they can actually squeeze a lot out of that too. And courtesy China, you can get BMS pretty cheap. Everybody talks about, IoT and so on, and they're like, you can't compete with China. And I keep pointing out that you don't. You use China for what they're good at. They make lots of stuff really cheap. So you can buy your sensors really cheap. Putting those sensors together in a package is where the actual IP and everything comes about, the value is derived. So use China for what they're good at, get your stuff cheap from China and, put together here if you want, because let's face it, you send your design to China, you're going to have 101 knockouts within a week. I've seen it happen, So, but yeah, I think in the Caribbean, power is actually one of the things that depends on what your application is and how you optimize it. power might be one of the least issues, in terms of being able to stick a solar panel in, and us being close to the equator for the most part, having nearly 8 to 10 hours of sun, you can pretty much charge up anything you need, you know. And it's, I think it's a less of a problem than plenty people think it is. If it is, and that and the fact that, even though we may say 25 degrees centigrade is cold, it's not freezing, and so we could actually cheat in a way because lithium ion cells love warm temperatures. They hate being frozen. So that's one of those things we don't actually have to worry about. You know, so you play to your strengths as a rule.
Yeah, I agree with Niram's point in terms of the power. Because we actually have pretty much at least 10 hours of sun every day throughout the region. Solar is a very low cost way to get power. In fact, a lot of the ham radio operators have been doing that for quite a while, where they put their repeaters in remote locations and they pair whether it's a solar panel or a wind generator with a car battery and the radio equipment, and that's been going on for quite a while. So yeah, power is probably not one of the issues we have to worry about so much. I just want to jump back a little to the telecommunications aspect. One of the dangers, one of the things we tend to fall prey to is that we look at the mainstream in developed countries and use that as the benchmark. And so we say, well, we only have 25 meg bandwidth of 25 meg and so on, or 10 meg, and think that that's inadequate because in developed countries people can get 100, 300 and gigabit connections. But in those very same developed countries, there are tons of areas that still, believe it or not, deal with dial-up. And so we should not look at not having the gigabit connection, access to the gigabit connections, as a limitation, and especially when we look at the type of data that needs to be transferred. If it's low bandwidth, the low bandwidth networks have been around for quite a while. Packet radio has been around for quite a while. The low is it the LoRaN networks that Nira mentioned is the new benchmark for IoT. And one of the nice things is that in the region, our telecommunication rules are not as strict as in the developed countries. I'm not saying that to mean that we can bypass the rules, but there's still a lot of room where we can get permission to do a lot of those things that we would not be able to do in those developed countries, or do it at a significantly higher cost for licensing and so on. So if there's no internet, broadband, whatever, in many cases we can build the networks if we need to, and we can throw things together and make it happen.
I agree with that sentiment, actually. I think Adani would like to say something. Have I pronounced your name correctly? If not, please tell me how.
Oh yeah, that's correct, Danny. I was just going back to the power. In terms of power, we actually have it, I think, better in the Caribbean than a lot of other places in the world, because a lot of places in the world they don't even have power in the area. For the most part, there are very few places I've been to on a bunch of the Caribbean islands where there's not a pole, at least within 100 feet or 200 feet of what you're trying to do. Sometimes overseas, you can go probably a couple miles before you even see a power line. Much less one that you can access. Usually, it's one for 66 kV and industrial applications passing through the mountainside. So a lot of times we work with solar panels. They have very large rivers, very strong rivers. So we work with a lot of water power, wind turbines as well. a lot of battery storage, and then we've started to working on stuff in terms of like a unit, like a mobile unit that you can just deploy somewhere. It has a solar panel, it has a small switch, PoE, and it has some battery and has some other devices, and you can put a bunch of cameras on it and just deploy it into the field without having to worry about a power source. So one thing that we probably rival a lot of the other countries on is power, because I've not had an issue locally in terms of electricity that I haven't had tenfold over there.
It's cool. So we've spoken about, people have mentioned telecom standards. How do we think, what do we think that we need modifications to any standards? So I know someone said earlier we should obviously adapt standards in some of those countries. How do you see standardization changing within the Caribbean in the future? And do you see that helping or hindering as a group?
Well, I think it would vary country to country. I know in Trinidad with TAP, they're very hands off, so pretty much, what was it they were looking at? I think it was LoRaWAN, LoRa and LoRaWAN they were looking at in terms of IoT and so on. And there are some people who are distributing these devices, so like Sigfox and some of these other modules, and they wanted TAT to regulate it essentially to say that that you need a license and that kind of thing. And essentially they're trying a smart way to kind of say, well, okay, if you want to use this, you have to buy it from us. And TAT looked at them and said, well, it's not a regulated bandwidth now. It does, based on the spectrum that is allocated, it's not going to conflict with anything that we have up. Once FCC has signed off on the device, you can use it. They say, however, if before you buy your device, they recommend you come in and consult with them, so they would advise you as to which particular frequency would be best for you to use. Because like I know digital is really 900 megahertz frequency, so obviously you don't want your devices with that, but all the other frequencies outside of that is perfectly fine. And there's some lobbying, and there's lobbying for some, but I at least in Trinidad, I know each country and into the regulators is a different case. Jerry might be able to provide some feedback on that one. But at least my role as the Internet Society member and having attended a lot of these TACTO, I think the regulators, they're in Trinidad at least, they have traditionally kept a very light touch approach. It's kind of like, if we don't need to muck with it, then that causes no problems. Then we're not going to regulate it. However, if you do want to do something to scale and you do want to offer it as a service to the public, then you probably should come in and talk to us. But if you are just setting up a little network for your personal private thing, then we're not gonna really bother with you too much. I think the distinction is when you start to offer it as a service to the general public, then then they will have to step in and say, well, okay, if you're offering this as a service to the public now, then we need to step in and regulate it to some degree, because you'll be required to maintain a certain quality of service and that kind of thing. But as I say, I'm speaking only in Trinidad and Tobago case. I don't know about other islands.
So is it possibly a problem that those standards would be island specific though?
Really,
from the point of view of businesses and expanding and providing services.
I think maybe it might be in terms of frequency and how the individual frequency is put out. But honestly, I don't see Caribbean Islands mandating anything too far from the, whatever the industry is using for present. Not very advantageous to have you know, a custom LoRaWAN chip or custom frequency chip for this part, you know, just this Caribbean island or that Caribbean island. You know, the economics don't make sense. I mean, I think a lot of Caribbean countries are very cognizant of that fact, you know. So they would in Trinidad they would tend to look at FCC guidelines first and say, well, okay, if the FCC guidelines is there, try to follow the FCC guidelines. You know, that works to our advantage to some degree because if it is we want to bring something new to Trinidad, we can kind of look and see what the FCC has done to some degree and say, well, okay, this is how they did that. It's not necessarily a direct one-to-one in terms of how um, the local regulator will deal with it, but you can use some level of guidance, you know, as to what potential issues may crop up when you approach them.
There, throughout the region, there is actually some attempt for harmonization of spectrum use. I know between the ECTEL states, Trinidad is involved, Barbados, and so on. So at least within the Eastern Caribbean, there is harmonization or attempts at harmonization. So that's not far-fetched, and having those standards in place should not be too difficult to make happen. The other standards, if it has to do with whether it's equipment, interfaces, and so on, I think it's something that we should definitely look at least at a regional level, because individually, each island would be too small to even make it cost effective to look at any customization at that level. But at least if we look regionally, then we can take advantage of the economies of scale, as small as they would be, and shared experiences, shared expertise throughout the region. Oh, I just wanted to add, I think Nicholas, you mentioned in terms of having specific frequencies. At least within the ECTEL member states, there is the option of having what's designated as community networks. So a project, let's say, for example, if there's a large-scale IoT project that would do, whether it's agricultural monitoring island-wide or industrial or something, there is the option of being set up under a community network where that network that provides the connectivity could get a special license for that. Now, I don't know. I know TAT tends to be a little more specific, more to the book, but I think they would also be fairly open to those types of systems, especially because there's a lot of regional collaboration on telecoms issues. Just to mention, I am actually with the regulator in St. Lucia, so I do have had some interaction with some of the various regulators around the region, and have been part of a number of those discussions.
Okay, it's good to have some people who actually knew about regulation in the Caribbean, because I had very little knowledge of current telecoms regulation in the Caribbean, actually. That's very useful. Thanks very much. So good from both yourself and Niran.
I think the thing we have to look at is that every country has, you know, so if someone came to the Internet Society and said, you know, we want to do this, you know, and we would like to look at it, we could actually, because we have a decent relationship with TAT or the regulator, so, you know, we could actually have a discussion with TAT and say, well, you know, we would like to have a workshop covering this topic, you know, and based on time and so on, you know, traditionally they have been very open, you know, to these kind of things, you know. People look at you and regulators as, you know, they're always kind of like, you can't do this, you can't do that. But, you know, at least my experience with them, you know, locally, you know, they tend to be very open, you know, to certain things, you know, and if it cannot be done because of regulation or something. They come out and they tell you, well, you can't do this or you can't do that. And they tend to be a little stickler when it comes to that aspect of it. But if it's something totally new that, is not on thing, they tend to give a pretty good open ear, into the, setting up consultations and so on and, finding out what is what, you know. So I think that if people in the different Caribbean countries, you have different groups that you can actually interface with that will help bridge that gap. And that is a resource that I think should be utilized.
What were you thinking?
I don't remember.
On the chat. I like that guy. Oh, I see. So you're saying it now?
Hi, Greg.
That's cool. Makes sense. I like everything I've heard actually. The one thing I say, so we've spoken a lot now about, telecoms, summary game, environment, agriculture. Are there any other, other industries that we think we've missed? And is there anybody interested in a particular area? I don't know, from engineering, tourism, some other area that we think can make use of IoT that's not currently making use of, etc.
Yes. So with regards, we touched on agriculture a lot, and I don't think we really explored energy at much depth because or power. You mentioned power, but I look at it more as energy and energy consumption and energy manipulation, because Internet of Things is not only just about monitoring. There's some element of control as well. So in terms of microgrids and energy consumption monitoring and control, that is a field that definitely as we progress and we move from persistent types of energy sources like fossil fuels to renewables and stuff, energy monitoring and control is going to be important. In terms of standardization, where we are right now in 2020 in terms of telecoms and spectrums and so on, and when we talk about data and internet communication, I don't really see much of a challenge there, because how I see it is that next 10, 20 years, everyone is going to have access to the internet, right? And it's going to be satellite, and the only other challenge there is in terms of is power, because some devices may not be able to manage that kind of transceiver and might need to use a different spectrum in order to transmit and receive data, right? Another major area is health, right? So this is something that we may want, that I see, I see public institutions, private institutions may want to monitor the health of the human resource in real time, in medical institutions and so on. That's another area that we can explore, and security as well. So those are, it's not only, this is, in my view, anything that changes that could affect the how you could say the homeostasis of your society or of your business, and there's real-time data, we're talking IoT. We're talking IoT, and we're talking high-level processing, aka machine learning, artificial intelligence. So I think it's a broad area, and things like, to me, I beg to differ from, in terms of the impact that standards and spectrum and so on will have in the next 10 to 20 years, but that's just how it's just my take.
John, you mentioned human resource. So what's your take on how IoT could help improve our economies by making us more efficient? Do you see that? Do you see possibilities of that? And how do you see uptake of that in society?
Yeah, so the thing is, for example, okay, let's say you are delivering goods or produce. You have a distribution network across Guyana, Suriname, or Jamaica, or whatever it is, and you have these vans and so on.
Mhm.
You can monitor the like perhaps the fuel consumption, the location, maximum, minimum speeds, these things in real time, and make adjustments in real time. You can have automated responses, automated alarms, artificial intelligence interventions. And of course, you could have these short-term interventions and also long-term interventions by collecting data over a long period of time, big data, deep learning, and stuff like that. So there are a lot of, and looking at it regionally, you could be distributing marketing goods with ships, with planes, with drones, and you just want to monitor how efficient your distribution network is. And this is just one example that popped into my head. So, so that's it.
Yeah, I also like what you said about security, because I see we are islands. I mean, there's monitoring of our borders, you know, via either cameras, satellite, radar. I see a lot of scope for that too. There's assistance with our coast guards, our police and armed forces. I think all of these are valid areas where I can see IoT. Security is maybe a big area in which you can help. I mean, not only in our coast, but in our businesses, talk about to reduce robberies, etc. So these are all maybe applications.
Yeah, for example, let's say you have a mall, commercial mall, and you let's say at some distant point in the future, you have a limit in the amount of people or the density of people in that geographic space. And if you could monitor somehow via whether it's mobile app or choose or real-time video monitoring, you can say, well, okay, you have reached the limit of the, you could monitor the densities or control the densities of of the people entering and exiting the mall, because you don't want to have, let's say, a health issue in terms of viral contagion or security issue, or perhaps a safety issue with the number of personnel in a particular space. So there's really endless opportunities to apply this IoT concept to, and it's really up to the visions of the private and public sector, how they see themselves managing or better managing their businesses, their enterprises, their organizations, or society, making it a more productive place, making it a more efficient place and a safer place. So we really need to push not only ourselves as individuals and as people who are involved in technology and science and engineering, but we need to, and through agencies like CariSTEM, etc., and as Niran was talking about in society, promote these things and make sure that our policymakers or legislators put the IoT and Industry 4.0 on the agenda in a real way, in a real and tangible way.
Yeah.
And to facilitate it.
I must add though, so with what you've just said, I want to say something. So you said something which I think is important. I think that even discussions like this should not be only the domain of people in the technical sphere, right? So we want people I believe that people should be involved in these discussions. We're not only in the technical sphere, they should be people who say what they want to be made aware of what is available and to say what they'd like. I mean,
yeah.
So that's why these kinds of conversations should not be only amongst technical people. I mean, this is not a very technical conversation we're having right now.
Yeah.
And so we must let it be very clear that these conversations are open to everyone.
Yeah. Can I just make a quick contribution on that? And actually, I sat by quietly and listened to like some of the problems that the different sector faces, and I actually think that the starting point would need to be sort of like developing an overarching vision and strategy that stakeholders need to get together. I think there needs to be sort of an agreement on what goals we should be developing for IoT in the Caribbean. I mean, I could think of several areas. My area, of course, is transport, but I could think of several areas that could benefit by working collaboratively. So if you think, for example, there's a lot of the infrastructure can actually be shared. So for example, I don't know if, like here where you have utility companies that go in and dig a trench, in the road, they also work with the telecoms companies sometimes to actually use the same, trenches to actually put in their infrastructure. So there are benefits to working collaboratively, but I do think that needs to be people need to come together to decide what the systems architecture should be, how different sort of sectors, what the different sector needs are, and how the systems for the different sectors will need to talk to each other. That needs to be sort of the conversation that takes place, and perhaps maybe best driven by the national government, so that you have an overarching strategy. That needs to be, of course, done with all of the relevant stakeholders sort of coming together, having conversation, discussing what their needs are, and then deciding what the roadmap should be, whether it's a 10-year plan, a 20-year plan. You have to have a vision. And I was just going to make sort of just illustrate from the transport planning point of view. I mean, we never really think of what happens in the transport sphere, for example. When you take your phone and you use a journey planner app, right? The amount of data that comes from this, for example, traffic data, if there is an incident on the road network, on Google, it tells us, well, you need to find, it diverts us automatically. That's because all of this information, all of this data in the United Kingdom and elsewhere is being shared. That goes through traffic management systems, right? Traffic management control systems. And all of this data, for example, on journey planning, what time the bus is arriving, you've got all of these responders on the bus network on the highway that actually tells you where the bus is at a certain given time. If you want to look at it, you could know where a train is on the underground if you want to look at this information. So in terms of journey planning, for example, I mean, I don't know if when you drive on the motorway here, you see signs sometimes telling you that you should reduce your speed to 50 miles per hour. There's no one on the road at, I don't know, 1 a.m. or 2 a.m., right? But it tells you to reduce your speed. That's because there's an incident ahead. And somehow the system has already responded to that by slowing down, traffic.
Just trying to stop a black man from driving fast, man.
But the point I'm making is that I think there are lots of benefits. Of course, we would need to develop sort of systems that are specific to our own issues and our own context. But I do think that there are opportunities, and I hear people talking about innovation. I hear people talking about sort of opportunities that we can start to think about what these sort of, how we could apply some of these opportunities to the problems that we have in St. Lucia, for example. We have a lot of traffic congestion. And there could be sort of, traffic systems that we put in place. I mean, in the UK and elsewhere, you have intelligent traffic light systems where you have an entire region, for example, that people don't think about that. So when you turn up at a traffic light and that traffic light let through, say, maybe, I don't know, 50 cars, sometimes it's because of what's happening on another junction that nobody actually realizes that because there's congestion in one part, it actually sort of, there's this adaptation and this intelligence behind how traffic moves through the city that we never think about. So I think a lot of this is probably more advanced than we would be ready for in the Caribbean, but I do think we need to start defining our visions now and then working towards this, sort of working collaboratively with stakeholders to get there.
I completely agree with that. And in terms of working collaboratively, we need to have the conversations because let's take an example that was mentioned in terms of traffic management. And on one hand, and knowing where the buses are on the other hand, um, in St. Lucia, for example, we have a bus system that's privately owned and operated. So you have those minibuses, or as the trainers would refer to it, the maxi taxis running the route, but they run anytime, anyhow, whatever. So if you want to catch a bus, you go stand by the road and hope that one comes along.
Yeah.
Now, if, for example, we want to put in a system that will give that kind of feedback,
Yes.
yes, you can do that, but that system can also support the intelligent traffic monitoring. So rather than looking at putting in isolated solutions, we need to have the broader conversation. What's the bigger plan, and how do those solutions we're putting in work towards the larger plan so that you're not replicating, you're not putting in islands of automation that end up being isolated, or you're spending too much money doing the same thing over and over.
Exactly.
That's all valid. I agree for everything I've heard. The only one thing I'd say is that when I think John was talking about mass gatherings in a mall, all I could think about was mass events, right? So I was just thinking about what IoT devices you could have in a Fed, and I couldn't get my mind off of that. But anyhow, because I could
So
see,
I
yeah.
was going to make another point. I don't know if you remember the Olympics in 2012. I mean,
Yeah.
here in London. I mean, Bluetooth technology, it was actually used like to manage people through the Olympic Park, for example, you know, on a massive scale, right? And that a lot of the clubs there, for example, like Sports Stadia here, they do that. For example, if they don't want sort of, you know, fans arriving at, you know, one station and then creating congestion at that station, they could simply direct or sort of, ping a message to a lot of people to sort of tell them to, instead of you go to another station and then walk from that station because there's congestion at one station. Again, that's quite sophisticated and very well developed, but there are lots of technologies that I think that could actually be beneficial to, like, you know, the Caribbean as well. I don't know what, I couldn't think of what technology you would use. Is it about sort of crowd dispersal?
No, but if you think about what you just said there, right? These events, right? The Caribbean has, for example, Trinidad has Carnival, which is a large mass gathering. I'm sure you'd need to direct people into places. You have parties where you have, I've been to parties, I think I was at a party some time ago, where one party was finishing and then you had another one at 3 o'clock in the morning, another one about to start, I think. Breakfast fed, right? And you have crowds coming through. So I can imagine lots of
that's right.
events where you can have
that. Just using that sort of technology on people's phone to actually get them
to get them, direct them where they need to go to.
A lot of it is being done already. Sorry to jump in there, but it would require a lot of negotiating. I think Jerry mentioned the big conversation, the big brother conversation. One of the areas I think it's ready to go and it should require a lot of attention is in music copyright and monitoring for royalties. That's an area that requires a lot of assistance. I think the area of mass crowd, even areas of cashless systems and stuff like that, a lot of that is already happening in terms of mass events and that kind of thing. But I think the area that requires the most attention and some kind of a solution that works for the Caribbean specifically, because in the first world countries, I don't think their way of calculating and doing monitoring for music is as apagal as it is in the Caribbean. And I think we need some kind of specific solution to do that kind of monitoring and the earnings potential for Caribbean artists. It a lot depends on that. Being able to have a system that can actually do that kind of monitoring, whether it be in hotels or it be in on radio stations, at events, that kind of connectivity and gathering of data and monitoring and measuring is a required thing.
Well, we're finishing up at the FET. Shall now wind up, I guess. with so does anybody have anything they'd like to say in
We have
summary?
a couple persons who have their hands up.
Hands up. So I think we'll let Danny go on, and then we'll have Wayne. Danny?
Oh, yeah, I was thinking on the last bit for the other ideas that food security was a huge issue in the Caribbean region for us. And I think the last article I saw on it, we were $10 billion in import bills across the Caribbean for our food, just importing it. So I think that would be a great place for IoT to help in terms of one stage helping the farmers grow better crops and grow crops that are needed across the region. Another stage where you would have the storage or wholesale part of things where you keep track of what's in stock, what's not in stock, what's in season. Use AI and machine learning to debate, a storm is coming. Your fruit is, or your fruit or your produce is maybe a couple of days from being ready. Pick it early so that you don't lose it in the storm. Tracking trucks delivering stuff to the consumer, tracking the front end, which is the retail store, and how much they use in terms of produce so that you can know how much to grow, and just basically have an entire system, not just in one country but across the entire Caribbean, where you can help food security, because you don't need to now import bananas from South America or the US, because you can get bananas from a number of other countries delivered to you, because you have that IoT system where you know that in your database you have at least 20 tons of bananas in 3 other different countries that you would not know about otherwise. And then you're tracking customer use so that you can see that, okay, customers are buying more and more bananas as the flu season comes along, increase the produce, and then you have that machine learning and AI data where you can learn, and then years and years of doing it will basically create a more efficient system and drop down our food import bill to a much lower number than 10 billion, what it should be or what it is right now.